Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome author, lecturer, researcher of ancient myth, language, and cosmology, Laird Scranton. How you doing tonight, Mr. Scranton?
I'm doing great, Chris, and it's Laird.
Laird, awesome. All right, well, I am doing great too. And, you know, this is one of my favorite topics, ancient history and cosmology, especially the things they don't teach you in school, history classes. And if it is talked about, you know, you're a conspiracy theorist or considered fringe. So I'm very excited to get into some of the stuff tonight. Before we do, I'd love to get a bit about your background and what got you started on your research.
Okay, I was born in Wallace, Idaho, a little silver mining town in Idaho. Grew up mostly in Oregon, in Salem, Oregon for elementary school and Portland, Oregon for high school. Then attended Vassar College. I was one of the early male co-eds at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, where I met my wife, Risa, who is from Albany, New York. We lived in Oregon for a few years and then eventually ended up back in Albany. My background is as a software designer, an independent software designer for numerous companies on IBM iSeries computers. My degree is in English from Vassar College. I became interested in the subject sort of by chance. My wife, Risa, had given me a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark, that every chapter in the book involved some unsolved mystery, and one of the mysteries is about a modern-day African tribe called the Dogon, primitive tribe who knew some things about astronomy they shouldn't know. And I sort of started pursuing that, and that led into a comparative study between, basically a comparative study of creation traditions between ancient cultures in Africa, Egypt, India, Tibet, and China, Turkey, and elsewhere around the world.
Very good. Now, in your opinion, why do you think that so much of this information is suppressed and not taught in schools and not taught in history?
Well, first of all, it's a paradigm that has been that has shifted over a very long period of time. This is a tradition that may have started as long as 12,000 years ago, and anyone who's ever played a game of telephone understands, you know, with the children's game telephone, understands that as information is communicated from the speaker to the listener, that things change. And over time, in most cultures, this information sort of morphed. My outlook, based on comparative studies, is, and based on what the Buddhists flatly say and what the African tribe, the Dogon, flatly say, that in ancient times, someone who knew an awful lot about how processes of creation happen provided deliberate instruction to humanity across the globe, pretty much. There are certain paradigms. Carl Jung was famously noticed that there were archetypes that appeared everywhere, and he was at a loss to explain how that could be. He ended up postulating theories of psychology to explain how it is that far distant cultures imagined processes of creation in the same way.
And it also seems like, you know, modern day academia, Egyptologists, they tend to stick with the same narratives. And if you know, someone does look outside the box, they're kind of shunned. Why do you think that you know, this suppression is taking place?
Well, in academic fields where reputations are at stake and funding is at stake, and people have boundaries of turf that separate fields of study, people have an investment in a position they've already signed on to. The positions, theories that they've already been taught, theories they may have come up with themselves, evidence that they put forward, published in books and so forth. And so it's all fairly resistant to change. One of the nice things about the independent researchers that I am sort of part of a community with is that hasn't happened yet to the same extent. That for the most part, the researchers are work openly with each other and cooperate with each other, and no one has really carved out hard and fast positions that have to be defended.
Yeah, and it also gives me hope that I do see some new up and coming researchers that are opening up new ideas, and it seems like there is some sort of awakening going on right now, where new ideas are being introduced and more accepted and more explored. You know, there's some interesting things going on with UFO sightings and all kinds of stuff right now. So
That's right.
things seem to be slightly shifting in our direction.
Yeah, a little bit. I've noticed that too, particularly with UFO studies, that even governmental stances on UFOs have done a recent turnaround. The government is now actively soliciting reports of sightings of UFOs, where as recently as, you know, half a decade ago, they were poo-pooing any sightings they found. So I can see some changes happening. Um, Open-mindedness is part of the key. The field that I'm in, you have researchers that range from the very fringe to the very academic, and so trying to anchor an outlook in a way that is credible is an important part of the process for anyone who wants to be taken seriously.
Now, it seems at some point in our history, humanity got basically an upgrade. The things that we knew seemed to take a great deal of, it seems like our knowledge greatly increased in a short amount of time. Would you agree?
I would agree, and pretty much every ancient culture in one way or another claims to have had assistance in that. Even the ancient Egyptians say that their written hieroglyphic language was gifted to them. The ancient Buddhists flatly claim that the most important of their symbols were gifted to humanity from a non-human source. Um, Naturally, that puts people off because we don't have a credible perspective. We typically don't have a credible perspective from which to understand how that could be true. But comparative analysis gives us a way of reconciling it. For me, for my field of study, the biggest threat to it is my own wishfulness. This is true of pretty much any researcher in this field, that it's terribly easy to imagine that a thing is true and go chasing off after it without it actually being true. I mean, resemblances crop up that look very compelling, and it's hard to distinguish what's a real comparative resemblance, a valid resemblance, and what's not, a significant resemblance, and what's not. So I'm fortunate in that I have two symbolic systems, one in Buddhism and one with the Dogon culture, that are a very close match to each other, but given in entirely different languages. And what that implies is that neither culture adopted it wholesale from the other culture. We have two independent cultures that for thousands of years kept these symbols straight. The Buddhist system was documented by around 400 BC, and the African system is given in ancient Egyptian words that went out of use around 750 BC. So they each have credible claim to being ancient. Now, my problem is that both traditions flatly claim that their knowledge came from a non-human source. So that puts a researcher like me in sort of a hard position. I work from the flat statements of ancient cultures, and my job is to test those statements and try to ask, is there a sensible perspective from which we can understand it to be true? Well, when I have two cultures claiming that it was given from a non-human source, I have two choices. I can either say that both of these cultures managed to keep all of the intimate details of this symbolic tradition straight for thousands of years, but then at the very last step of it, both misremembered who they got it from in the same way. Right. Or I can say they kept that last piece of information straight also, and because they're both claiming the same thing, then as a researcher, I have to allow the possibility that somehow they managed to get this information from a non-human source.
Now, these aren't the only basically ancient cultures that claim to get their knowledge from basically a non-human source, right?
No, virtually every ancient culture, every ancient religion, some modern religions, pretty much every modern religion makes claims for non-human intervention in the form of deities, in the form of teachers, in the form of, one form or another, someone who was a heck of a lot more knowledgeable than humanity was in ancient times who helped them out, and sometimes who stood in their way, actually. So this is not at all a radical viewpoint. This is the consistent viewpoint.
So, based on your research, would you say it's more of a spiritual contact, or maybe off-planet, or interdimensional, maybe a mix of all?
There are a lot of reasons to suspect that it's traditional sci-fi contacts. That's what Robert Temple, who wrote a book in 1975 called The Sirius Mystery, he was trying to explain why the Dogon Tribe knew facts about the star system of Sirius that they shouldn't know. And his perspective was this could be an indication of an alien contact in the traditional sci-fi sense. However, the Buddhist claim is for knowledge passed from a non-human source. The Dogon take it a step further and say not only was it non-human, but it was also originally non-material. Now, to try to put that in perspective, the foundational philosophy that all of this seems to rest on is a philosophy out of India called Samkhya. It was a companion to yoga. And Samkhya believes, or actually it isn't even presented as a belief, it's presented as fact. In the perspective of Samkhya, universes form in pairs, one non-material and one material. That's the routine way that universes form, and that there is a cycle of energy between the non-material and the material universes that is as essential to life as the natural water cycle is on the planet Earth. The natural water cycle is the cycle where water evaporates from the oceans and forms clouds that then rise up over the mountains, create rain that then flows back to the sea. If we didn't have that cycle of water, we wouldn't have life on the planet. The Dogon and the Samkhya philosophers are saying that if we didn't have the cycle of energy between universes, we similarly would not have life in the universe. So in Samkhya's view, the non-material universe has perfect knowledge, but an inability to act. And the material universe has imperfect knowledge with full ability to act. And so Samkhya says that there are routine attempts made to communicate knowledge from the non-material side or to induce action on the material side by the non-material side. And those come in the form of vivid dreams, the unusual behavior of animals, synchronicities that we see in everyday life, clairvoyance, all the paranormal, telepathy and anything that we consider to be paranormal, it could also potentially be a part of that. Now, my job as a researcher was to try to find a perspective from which any of that could make sense. And although it's probably more complicated than I can explain in a convincing way in the amount of time we have, I can tell you that there is a scientific perspective that from which that could be seems perfectly reasonable and perfectly possible. And it has to do with the way Einstein says the dynamics of matter and energy work. If those work the way Einstein says that they do, then there is a perspective from which instruction could be received from a non-material side. At certain points in the cycle, there's a perspective from which non-material entity could take action in a material domain, the way the Dogons say that they did. And so part of my job has been to test and correlate and try to interlink what the ancient cultures are saying with what the modern scientists are saying.
All these ancient cultures, they seem to have direct contact with, like you were saying, this immaterial source. Why do you think this stopped? What happened along the way that there's no longer this communication?
Well, the Buddhists and the Hindus are talking about a Yuga Cycle. The Yuga Cycle is a grand cycle, the largest cycle that humanity experiences, cycle of time that humanity experiences. From a traditional perspective, that's about a 26,000 year cycle, and it's tied with the concept of precession of the equinoxes, which is what looks to us like a very slow rotation of constellations around us. If you were to watch the sunrise in the morning, just before the sun rises, if you were to take note of what constellation sat behind the sun, and you did that every day for 70 years, you would see that the constellation had moved 1 degree. And it continues to do that at a very slow pace over the course of 26,000 years. You would see those constellations rotate around us, cycle around us, and back around to the original constellation you started with. Now, in the Buddhist perspective, that Yuga cycle causes humanity in different eras of the cycle to be more capable or less capable of perceiving the non-material universe that is treated as its twin universe. Scientifically speaking, if we're talking about energy, what seems to be happening is that as the energy scrolls from one universe to the other universe, it's not just energy that's scrolling, it's also mass. And Einstein says that if a thing becomes more massive, its time frame also slows down. This is relativity, it's dilation of time, it's a principle of Einstein's theories. So we have one universe becoming more massive while the other one becomes less massive, and what we're doing is we're shifting the relative time frames of the two universes. At the middle of the cycle, the time frames are a match, and at that point of the cycle, it's conceivable, it works like an airlock does when you have water pressure or air pressure. When the pressure is equalized, it's possible to move from one domain to another. You can move out of the submarine into the underwater, or you can move out of a spaceship, into the outside into space, if you can equalize the pressure between the two domains. This is, if you think of that Yuga cycle as a great year is the metaphor that's applied to it, then at the equinox of that great year is when those time frames are equalizing. That's why one of the reasons why I think the equinox is as significant as it is to ancient cultures, because it's at that point that crossing over between the universes might be feasible. In Judaism, at the equinox, they celebrated a holiday called Passover. And at the end of a traditional Passover Seder, they open a door to the outside to allow a non-material entity named Eliyahu to step in. They're basically acting out the dynamic I'm saying might be conceivable. So it's not like it's even a wild theory here. Every Jew in the world is acting that out on the equinox.
Right, and you had mentioned the yugas. Are we supposedly going into an upcycle right now? Is that right?
From my perspective, okay, the different perspectives on how long the cycle is and at what point of the cycle we're presently at. The traditional Buddhist perspective is that we're about 1,200 years into the upward cycle. It's called a descending cycle and an ascending cycle. Descending is when a universe is becoming more massive, and ascending is when it's becoming less massive. Descending, your time frame is slowing down. Ascending, it's speeding up. Now, if you think about it, astronomers use their telescopes to look out into the universe, and they're perplexed because they've noticed that through their measurements, it looks as if the speed at which the universe is expanding, the rate at which it's expanding, is speeding up. It's getting quicker. And they can't imagine, how can that be? What could possibly be pushing the expansion to make it happen more quickly? From Samkhya's perspective, that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is we're seeing a slowing of our own time frame, our own relative time frame. When we look back, it looks like events are occurring more quickly because our time frame is running more slowly. It's like if you ever have ridden a train and there was a second train next to you, and so you're both sitting still in the station. One of the trains starts to move. The passengers have a hard time telling, is the train I'm on moving forward, or is the train next to me moving backwards? It's the same kind of illusion that happens. So from that perspective, I can see that the Samkhya viewpoint is upheld. There are effects that make it look as if our time frame is slowing down, and that could be a consequence of energy increasing our mass.
That's fascinating. Now, I want to get into the Dogon Tribe. That's fascinating to me as well. Talk about what it is that made them so advanced.
Their claim is that someone who knew all this stuff taught it to them in ancient times. That's the Buddhist claim also. Now, as I said, okay, the information is not being given as theory. The Dogon flatly say that their symbolic system describes how matter forms. But the truth is that there are three symbolic themes that are being addressed in the Dogon culture. One is how the universe forms, another is how matter forms, and the third is how biological creation happens. And whoever put together their symbolic system saw parallelism among those three themes, so much so that they ended up simultaneously describing all three of those themes using a single progression of symbols. That's partly why the symbols are so hard to understand. You can't ask, what does this symbol mean? You have to ask, what does it mean if we're talking about matter, or what does it mean if we're talking about biological reproduction? We know that biological reproduction begins with a fertilized egg. Well, parallelism in the symbolism tells us that the universe started with what's called a cosmogonic egg, and scientists like Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene agree that there was a singularity that preceded the formation of our universe that is conceptually akin to an egg. In Dogon culture, Dogon and Egyptian culture, because there are strong similarities between, let me rewind a little bit here. The Dogon culture is a good entry point because they have societal elements that are in common with three different ancient traditions. They have rituals that are like Judaism. They have civic practices that are like ancient Egypt. And they have a symbolic cosmology like ancient Buddhism. And so if I were, in retrospect, trying to pick the best entry point to do a comparative study, the Dogon are a really lucky place to have started, because they have elements of all these other traditions that make a good point of comparison. Also, the Dogon priests this is a living tribe. The priests understand their own symbols, understand their own words, and as a society, they place a priority on preserving original forms. So anthropologists who spoke to the Dogon priests could get a straight answer about what a symbol meant or what a word meant, and we can test those against what other cultures think the same symbol or the same word means.
Now, in some ways, their use of symbology had more effective, it communicated a lot more than our modern language in some ways. Is that right?
Yes. Well, Socrates felt that okay, originally this was an oral tradition. It was communicated from an expert to a student, essentially. It's no different than, let's say, leather bookbinding or very advanced wood carving. That if you were a student wanting to learn these practices, you would want to learn it from the guy who'd been doing it for 30 years. You wouldn't want to learn it from articles online. Socrates and the Dogon both see written language as a degradation of the process. Written language is not as good a way to learn a thing as it is to learn it from somebody who understands it. And so the Dogon prioritize an oral tradition because that fosters a person who has to thoroughly understand his subject. And that's the way you want to go. That's the way to preserve knowledge. And in my experience, over the thousands and thousands of years that have passed, the cultures who never adopted a written language are the ones who did the best job of passing it down intact.
Now, you said they had knowledge of the way matter forms. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. I could see coming into it, I didn't know all that much about the stages of how matter forms from waves to an atom. But from the outset, I could see that the Dogon were talking about a structure called the Po that's very much like an atom. That they say all things are made beginning with the Po, and they're formed by the continuous addition of like elements until the thing is finally created. I also knew about protons, electrons, and neutrons, which are components of an atom. The Dogon say that they're their atom is made up of something called Sene seeds. And the Sene seeds combine at the center of the pole like protons and neutrons do, and then cross in all directions to surround the pole to form a nest, in the same way that an electron does. And then they provide us with a little helpful drawing of what they mean. And the drawing is a very close representation of what you would see, what we do see when an electron microscope images the electron cloud of an atom. The shape that the Dogon draw is one of the shapes that electrons take when they orbit, an orbital pattern they make when they orbit an atom. So I could see that the Dogon knew what they were talking about in terms of the topmost levels, but they had this entire descending level of structures that I had no idea if they were right or not. So I started doing some study. I researched what Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene had to say about matter. They are two popularizers of science who talk in general terms about how matter forms. And I discovered that you could set, in many cases, you could set the Dogon description and drawing side by side with Stephen Hawking's description and drawing of the same stage of matter, or Brian Greene's description and drawing of the same stage, and they're an intuitive match. In some cases, you could even substitute the Dogon paragraph in place of Hawking's paragraph, and he wouldn't change the meaning of his book. So clearly the Dogon knew what they were talking about. For the Dogon, matter begins as waves, just as it does for modern astrophysicists, and a transformation happens from waves to particles that creates the material universe that we all experience. The Dogon see this in three stages, or three worlds, they call them. There's the original world where reality really exists, which is wave-like, and then there's a second world where the wave is disrupted and sort of reconfigured to create subparticles of matter. And then there's the material domain that we live in, where these particles of matter have created structures that we experience every day.
And am I correct in saying that the way that they learn, the knowledge that's given from the elders is sort of like a mystery school type, that certain things are held back until you're initiated into that knowledge? Is that correct?
Yes and no. The way that it is in a typical esoteric tradition that we see in the form that we see it all around the world. We see it as far away as Polynesia. In New Zealand, the Maori in New Zealand follow an esoteric tradition that is in the same pattern. And the way it works is, if you're an instructor or an informant, a priest or an expert, and I'm a student, it's my job to ask the questions that push my education forward. Your job, when I ask a question that's appropriate to whatever my educational status is with you, your job is to respond truthfully to my questions. If I ask a question that steps outside of or goes beyond my initiated status, then your job is either to remain silent or, if necessary, to lie to protect innermost information of the tradition. Now, any person in Dogon culture, whether they're a Dogon Tribes person or an outsider, has the potential to learn the inner secrets of the tradition if they follow that process. But if I were to come from the outside and start asking leading questions of a Dogon priest about what their symbolic system's about, the priest would either not respond to me, or he would concoct an answer to satisfy me but put me off. He wouldn't tell me the truth of the situation. So that's basically the way it works. The Dogon women study with the women, the men study with the men. Any person can potentially learn become an initiate in the tradition. There's a French anthropologist who studied the Dogon for 30 years, and through his studies, he began asking questions that stepped into this esoteric domain, and he was asking them in an orderly way. You know, he was building his knowledge up from the bottom to the upward. And finally, a Dogon priest he was working with thought to himself, look, I can't answer this question. I don't think I can answer this question because I'm not sure I'm allowed to initiate an outsider outside the tribe. So he took it took the issue to a tribal council and said, look, what do I do here? This guy has been doing everything an initiate should do to be given the correct, truthful answers. Do I tell him or don't I? And the tribal council said, absolutely, this is open to whoever pursues it is the ones who get it. Now, what's interesting is that that's representative of how Samkhya says the dynamic works between the non-material and the material universe in terms of passing knowledge esoterically. I mean, through esoteric means, like through dreams and through the methods I mentioned. That the person who starts paying attention to it, who credits, say, a coincidence as possibly having some meaning to it, will foster that to themselves. They will, if they're paying attention, they'll see that they get confirmation when the coincidence is an intended, how can I say, an informative coincidence as opposed to one that's just an everyday coincidence, because we do have both. It is possible that I'm walking down the stairs when you're walking up the stairs and we bump into each other. That's an everyday coincidence. But the kinds of intentional coincidences that relate to the tradition tend to come with self-confirmation. It won't just be one coincidence. The person will notice the same odd reference turning up in several different contexts in their life over the course of a couple of days. Or dreams work this way. If you have a particularly vivid dream, you'll find that all of the images in the dream relate to each other in terms of ancient language. If I go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and I look up the major elements of a dream I've had, a vivid dream I've had, very often I'll find that the Egyptian words all are expressed using the same phonetic value. They're like homonyms of each other. And so they self-confirm each other because they're all pronounced the same way. That kind of confirmation. There are all sorts of other ways that it confirms. Kabbalism, which is the esoteric branch of Judaism, defines half a dozen or more methods by which people are informed about these things. There are some people who have to go into a trance, like Edgar Casey did, to get information. And there are other people who get it through vivid dreams, or there are other people who are clairvoyants. They seem to have premonitions about what's going to happen. And there are all these different classes of how people obtain knowledge.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And another aspect of this that I find so interesting, and it to me it points to, again, the non-material source giving information, is the similarity between megalithic structures across the planet. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, if we imagine that I'm not sure if you're familiar with the site called Göbekli Tepe.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Okay, that's the earliest evidence we have of certain civilizing skills. From the Dogon perspective, what was being presented to them anciently was a civilizing plan whose main thrust was to establish agriculture, interlinked with or intertwined with a symbolic cosmology that talked about processes of creation. And the two went hand in hand with each other, so that as one concept was being taught, you were never just being taught one thing. Any process you were being taught had bearing on many different aspects of your knowledge. There's alignment geometry for a Buddhist shrine called a stupa, and that alignment geometry teaches a whole wealth of different things at the same time. As you're learning the geometry of how to get this shrine to align with north, south, east, and west, which is teaching geography basically, you're also creating a structure for a sundial to tell time with. You're creating a structure for a calendar to judge the length of the seasons of the year. You're doing all sorts of things simultaneously that are being instructed in ways that self-reinforce each other, because you're learning one thing and now are able to apply it many different times, many different ways. All of these ancient cultures have aspects, they retain aspects of that same instructed tradition. There are people who say, well, the pyramids may not be related to each other, that in South America, you know, any culture that builds with stone is going to eventually think to stack the stones up and make a pyramid. There are only so many things you can do with stone. And I don't disagree with that. The problem is that pyramids around the world are all associated with symbolism that is very complicated, that doesn't automatically accrue from stacking stones up. That culture after culture imagines that pyramid as the womb of a woman who's lying on her back, or they associate the faces of the pyramid with 4 star groups that they use to regulate the agricultural cycle. There are many different aspects of the symbolism, and it's the symbolism that argues that this was not parallel development, this was part of an instructed system that we're seeing the results of. And so the stonework that you're seeing in Peru that looks so similar to stonework that we see in ancient Egypt, from my point of view, that happens because they all had the same stonework teachers. That at Göbekli Tepe we see 30 or more buried stone circles with pillars and carvings and other iconic symbols on them. Those look to me like final class projects for a group of stonemasons. If they were all taught by the same teachers, then it's not at all unthinkable that they would end up producing structures that look alike.
Now, you mentioned the pyramids. There's so many theories about what the possible purposes for these could be. Any thoughts on any other purposes that they may serve?
Yes, but it gets complicated, and there are as many theories as I have fingers and toes, at least, about what the pyramids represent, and it's very difficult to anchor those in a way that you can absolutely defend. I think Christopher Dunn has some of the more coherent views on how the Egyptian pyramids at Giza might relate to power or energy. Many of the stone structures that we see, stone circles we see in the United Kingdom and other places, have relationships to energy, that the stones are made out of material that will generate electricity as groundwater rises and sinks. The groundwater that they're set into rises and sinks. As a matter of fact, my friend Maria Wheatley has been involved in experiments that has measured that energy discharges from the stones themselves and between the stones at different levels up and down the stone, depending on what's happening with the groundwater. There are arguments to be made all over the world that there are these connections to energy, and nobody is certain what ancient cultures might have been doing with that energy. There are also linguistic connections to concepts of gateways with certain kinds of structures. The ancient Egyptians have a kind of a shrine that they define called an Aket, that they interpret as being a gateway between the non-material and the material. So there's a potential that something like that's going on with some of the structures. The structures change over time, and the form of the structures change over time. We were talking about the symbolism of the two universes and the energy scrolling between the two. Well, if you think of that energy as being a cycle, the energy scrolls one way and then scrolls back after a certain period of time. And so as that energy scrolls, the universe that used to be more material is suddenly now less material. And so all of the symbolism that pertains to being material or being non-material suddenly flips in the middle of this cycle. That in archaic times, a circle was representative of the earth. Midway through the cycle, suddenly a square becomes representative of the earth. And so the Dogon and the Buddhists have matching shrine forms. The Dogon culminates in a round base. The Buddhist culminates in a square base. I can argue that the Dogon shrine is the older form. It takes the archaic form, not the more modern form. And there's all kinds of symbolism like that works the same way based on the scrolling energy. So the simple answer to your question is, yes, I think pyramids may have been used for much more than is traditionally thought they were. Trying to pin down precisely what they were used for is a very tricky thing, and I don't think anybody has really successfully done it. I do believe Robert Bauval's observation that the three large pyramids of Giza relate to the belt star of Orion is a correct observation, because the Dogon specifically support it. They place large stones on a plateau to represent stars, including specifically the belt stars of Orion, and they provide us with a rationale for why they're doing that checks out scientifically. They're pointing to a structure that is where they say it is, even though we can't see it without time-lapse photography.
Wow. Now, what are some of the other tribes that aren't really talked about that may be just as advanced or even more that you've researched?
There are some very easy ways of finding these tribes. I found them all over. I found groups, ancient groups. As I said, I've moved geographically from Africa to Egypt, to India, to Tibet and China, to the Fertile Crescent region, to the United Kingdom, and most recently to New Zealand. But I can see traces of the same tradition all over the world. I mean, the paradigm is this. You may remember from the Old Testament when Moses is on the mountain with the tablets and supposedly is communing with God on the mountain. But the Israelites are strongly cautioned not to approach too closely to the mountain because there are bad effects that can accrue to them if they do. The Dogons say that was a concern for their teachers also, that their teachers were very concerned about what bad effects would come to us from being around them. So to limit that, the method they used was to sequester 8 tribespeople at a remote location, instruct those 8 in civilizing skills and in concepts of cosmology, and then send those back to instruct the group they came from. Now that's a dynamic that we see play out all over the world. We see it in myths in China, in South America, in Egypt, in Africa, in Polynesia. Pretty much everywhere there's a tradition of 8 quasi-mythical ancestors, godlike ancestors who brought civilizing skills in ancient times. The Dogon are saying there's a reason for that. The reason is because that's the structure that was used to pass this instruction along.
Now, there's so many theories that, modern humans originated in Africa, but I've also heard a lot of researchers say that it all started in Australia with Aborigines. What are your thoughts on that?
That's another tough one to get our arms around for a couple of reasons. First of all, anatomically, modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years, based on archaeological evidence, possibly longer than that. The entire history of civilization, as far as we know, is 12,000 years long. The reason we say that, I can say that, is because the Ice Age, last Ice Age, which ended about 12,000 years ago, serves as sort of a block to evidence. It sort of washed away any hope we have of making positive connections through evidence to what humans were doing prior to that time. But if it only took us 12,000 years or less to move from a point where we didn't have agriculture to where we are now, we have time for that to have happened many, many, many times previously. So when you say, where did civilization start, how far back do you want to go with that? There could very well have been civilization in Australia in the previous 12,000 year cycle. I can't argue that there wasn't, but there may have been civilization prior to that too. So it's a moving target. It's a goalpost that shifts.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Now, you mentioned the cyclical cycles. So the possibilities that this version of humanity could have had many different versions even before the previous 12,000 year cycle. I mean, thinking about that, we could even go back millions of years if that's possible.
That's right. And a friend of mine, Michael Cremo, wrote a very important book a few decades. Yes, it's Forbidden Archaeology. I'm sure you're aware of it. It's a 700-page book that documents anomalous findings of archaeologists around the world. objects that are just not appropriate to the strata that they were found in, given what we think culture was like in those times. And it's a tough book to make your way through, but it's a really worthwhile book to make your way through, because you realize that the official story of archaeology and the official story of what my friend John Anthony West would have called the Church of Progress that we're presented with as a theory doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. That if you look at the evidence, it looks like things were much less linear than that. We might have had high society, high civilization much earlier, where the ancient Egyptians talk about a first time, and the Buddhists talk about the first time knowledge was passed to humanity by a Buddha. The Dogon talk about a time when humanity was restored to knowledge. And so the Dogon outlook implies that there was high civilization before.
Now, something else that fascinates me that you've researched is the fact that, well, possible that our solar system could have been extremely different than it is now. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I've only touched on it sort of peripherally. I took time out from my comparative studies to write about another comparative cosmologist, a man named Emanuel Velikovsky, who had very controversial theory about how the planet Venus formed based on ancient written texts and other references, myths and artwork and other ancient references. And from his point of view, his point of view on how Venus was formed is that a large object hit Jupiter sometime in the historical memory of humanity, and the result of that collision produced what eventually became Venus. It produced what looked like a comet at first, and that comet was in the plane of the orbits of the planets and ended up wreaking havoc for quite a number of generations, made what Velikovsky claims was a direct impact on Mars. Now, the damage we see to Mars crust is actually could have been created by a direct impact by a planet-sized object, according to a Cal Peck study that was done, I think, in 2010. No, actually 2007. Velikovsky says that both Mars and Venus made close approaches to the Earth, and Mars's approach was at around 750, somewhere before 750 BC. Well, there are huge effects on the Earth that are unexplained that happened around 750 BC, actually around 709 BC. There's a huge fluctuation in the magnetic field that nobody can explain. There is a difficulty, you know, when we talk about total eclipses, we have software that can retrospectively calculate or confirm the dates and the places of total eclipses of the sun that have happened, because theoretically these are like clockwork motions of the sun, the moon, and the earth that cause eclipses to happen. And so if those really do work like clockwork, then we can use math to confirm that an eclipse happened on the date someone said it happened in the place they said it happened. That's true for every eclipse that has happened since 709 BC. It's not true for any eclipse that was reported prior to 709 BC. Something major happened at 709 BC that looks like it disrupted the motions of those three bodies, or the relationship of the three bodies. We have major climate change after that, such that crops that had been grown for thousands of years in China could no longer be grown there. We suddenly see all of the ancient German tribes move southward at the same moment after 709 BC. We see from ice cores that there was a major period of volcanic activity they can't explain. One of the two greatest periods of volcanic activity in geological history happened then. We have a change in the rate at which ions were absorbed by plants. That's what radiometric dating is based on. And so the methods of carbon dating and radiometric dating that happen, they don't work seamlessly across that boundary. There has to be a fudge factor applied to account for the fact that suddenly things had changed. Just after 709 BC, cultures that for thousands of years had observed a 360-day year suddenly switched to a 365-day year, all of them, all around the world at the same moment the same approximate moment, we're switching to a new calendar for reasons we can't explain. If it hadn't been an actual physical change in the length of the year, then we're sort of at a loss to explain what could have induced some culture on an island out in the middle of the Pacific to change their calendar at the same time that people in China or in India were changing their calendars.
That's very interesting.
So that looks like there has been disruption of that sort in our solar system. There are talk by some researchers that the sort of billiard game knocked Jupiter out of its original orbit, knocked Mars out of its original orbit, that Venus, which was originally reported as being a comet, it was classed alongside the sun and the moon, not the planets, by cultures all around the world for thousands of years. They reported being able to see it move across the sky during the day the same way they saw the sun. In China and in Korea, we have synchronized astronomical observations between two different cultures. And on the same day in the same year, both cultures are reporting seeing a supernova that presented in the same way that...
Hey, Laird, you froze up there.
There we go. I'm back again.
There you are. Okay, yeah, I lost a good
that.
bit of you. That's okay.
Okay, so we have in Korea and in Japan, we have matched astronomical records, synchronized astronomical records, so that on a particular day, we have reports from two different cultures of a supernova that they observed, and each of the cultures describes it as looking like Venus, only they're using terms that are normally reserved for comets in both cultures. So clearly both cultures thought that Venus was a comet at that time, not a planet. We have, had I talked about effects on the planet at 709 BC?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, whoops, I just lost you.
Nope, I'm here.
Okay. According to Velikovsky, Venus was in the plane of the planets. It was roaming as a comet in the plane of the planets, and it created havoc for a number of millennia. That it made a direct impact on Mars, which is a credible statement because the damage we see to the crust of Mars, according to a Caltech study, could have been caused by a direct impact by a planet-sized body. And we had, supposedly, Venus made a close approach to the Earth about 1500 BC at about the time of the eruption of Thera that ended the Old Kingdom of Egypt and ended the Minoan civilization. Mars supposedly made a close approach around 709 BC. And we have all sorts of effects on the Earth that support the idea that might have happened. The most obvious is found with total eclipses of the sun. That eclipses happen because of relationships between the motions of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. And those are supposedly like clockwork. So if that's true, if they are like clockwork, then we can use mathematics, we can use computer programs to calculate retrospectively and confirm that an eclipse happened on a particular date in a particular place. That works for every total eclipse that has been reported since 709 BC. It doesn't work for any total eclipse that was reported prior to any 709 BC in any culture. There were 40 reports in China alone, and they can't confirm them. Now, if we don't know, if we can't confirm those dates of those eclipses, then we don't have any basis for saying that we know where the stars were in relationship to us then. We can't verify that our orientation to the stars is the same now as it was then. At 709 BC, you have other effects that are very suggestive. You have a huge fluctuation in the magnetic field that they can't explain. You have cultures all over the planet suddenly changed their calendars from a 360-day year calendar, which they'd had for thousands of years, to a 365-day year. Now, why would a very distant culture with no contact with, say, Egypt or cultures in India and so forth, opt to change their calendar at the same moment as the other cultures did, if they weren't responding to a real change in length of the year? We have changes in climate such that crops that had been grown for thousands of years in China could no longer be grown there. We have German tribes all moving southward at the same moment following 709 BC for no apparent reason. We have changes in the rate at which plants absorb ions. That's a basis for radiometric dating. The radiometric dating routines have a problem across the boundary of 709 BC. They have to have fudge factors applied to be able to work properly. We can tell from ice cores that there was major volcanic activity that happened 709 BC. It's considered to be one of the two major volcanic eras of human history. They don't know why. So clearly something very big happened at 709 BC. Velikovsky says it was the close approach of Mars, which had been knocked out of its orbit, according to Velikovsky. So we have those kinds of disruptions in the solar system happening that I can point to from my work. We have some researchers who say that Jupiter was originally closer to the sun than it is now. We have researchers who say Mars isn't positioned where it was originally. Velikovsky is saying that Venus wasn't originally in its position, but has now settled down into a circular orbit between us and Mercury. Those kinds of disruptions I can agree with.
Well, now, all that being said, the 12,000-year cycle, the solar system may have been different. All these cataclysms, these cyclical cataclysms, it may be possible that we may be the next lost civilization if there's another cataclysm like that, right?
That's true. And also, there are indications in many ancient cultures that the tilt of our axis changes periodically. There are Egyptian texts that say that 3 times in the memory of Egyptian culture, the sun rose where it formerly set. In ancient China, there are reports that the sun disappeared for a period of time, and all of the emperor's advisors were basically laying bets on where the sun would reappear when it reappeared, and nobody guessed that it would be in the east. Things like that. Now we have Charles Hapgood. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's the person who promoted the idea of crustal shift on the planet, the idea that the crust of the Earth slips periodically, and that's what's going on. I don't really agree with that. I think that if it had slipped at all in the last 5,000 years, the Great Pyramid would no longer be perfectly aligned to north, south, east, and west. What I can agree with is that it looks like electromagnetism might cause the tilt of the axis to spin. And with the kind of effects that we're seeing right now with our magnetic pole being apparently on the verge of flipping, there's no one who can say that when it flips that it doesn't also cause the Earth to sort of spin under it, the way that 2 magnets can flip because of magnetic effects. Now, it may end up pretty much in the same orientation. We see places like Hudson's Bay that give all the appearance of being the site of a previous ice cap. As a matter of fact, just today I posted an article about Mars. They've discovered massive amounts of water at the poles on Mars. Enough water that if they could melt it all, the entire planet would be covered with water. Now, that's built up in layers. There's a layer of ice and then a layer of dust, and a layer of ice and a layer of dust. It looks like that's caused by repeated changes in the tilt of the axis of Mars, where the cap melts and then it freezes again, it melts and then freezes again. We have on the Earth massive growth of petrified forests at the South Pole, in Antarctica, trees of the size that Lewis and Clark found on the West Coast when they arrived there in the 1800s, you can't grow that kind of a tree at the South Pole with the amount of sunlight we have there. So the indication is the South Pole was not always situated at the South Pole. Hapgood's another person who supports that idea because he presents a map called the Peary-Reese map that shows Antarctica without ice on it. And the features that are on the map for Antarctica are what Antarctica looks like under the ice. So somebody in human memory knew Antarctica when there wasn't any ice there.
That's all amazing information. And Laird, I want to thank you again so much for coming on tonight. That was fantastic, and I'm going to have you back on.
I'd be happy to come back sometime. Sorry about the little glitches in internet service we've had tonight.
No, that's okay. It'll all be easily fixed. And thank you so much again. We'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris.
All right, you have a good night.
You too.